The sting of my own son's hand across my face was less shocking than the words that followed, each syllable a shard of ice lodging in my heart. "This isn't your home anymore, old woman. Get out." He, Klaus, my only child, the boy I'd shielded from the harsh Berlin winters with my own threadbare coat, the child for whom I'd worked my fingers to the bone after his father, my beloved Wilhelm, was taken by the fever, stood there, his eyes as cold and gray as the January sky over the Tiergarten. Behind him, his wife Brigitte, a woman whose ambition was as sharp and pointed as her stiletto heels, offered a small, satisfied smirk, a tiny moo of triumph that twisted her pretty doll-like features into something ugly. They thought they had broken me, cast me out like refuse onto the unforgiving cobblestones of a life I no longer recognized, a life they had systematically, cruelly dismantled. But in the icy grip of that betrayal, in the echoing silence of my own apartment from which I was now so brutally dispossessed, something else ignited, not just the searing pain of a mother's broken heart, but the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had survived far worse than their pathetic avarice, a woman who had seen empires fall and walls crumble, both literal and metaphorical. They would learn, oh, they would learn, that an old woman's roots run deeper than any foundation they could usurp, and that sometimes the greatest strength is forged in the fires of the deepest betrayal, a betrayal that cut deeper because it came from my own flesh and blood. This is how I took back, not just a home, but my name, my dignity, from the very hands that had sought to obliterate them, the hands I had once held with such tenderness, the hands I had taught to tie their own shoelaces. Now let me tell you what really happened, how the quiet comfort of my later years, in the Berlin apartment Wilhelm and I had scrimped and saved for, became a battlefield for my very survival. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow, insidious creep of entitlement that I, in my maternal blindness, had initially mistaken for filial concern. Klaus had always been ambitious. Even as a boy, he dreamed of more than our modest, working-class existence. Wilhelm, a carpenter with hands as skilled as they were calloused, had wanted him to learn a trade, to appreciate the dignity of honest labor, but Klaus had other ideas. Ideas fueled by the glossy magazines he'd devour, the tales of a glittering, effortless success that seemed a world away from our reality in post-war, then divided, and finally reunified Berlin. I'd supported his dreams, of course. What mother wouldn't? I'd taken on extra mending work, my eyesight already beginning to fail, to pay for his night classes in business administration. I'd gone without new shoes, my old ones patched and repatched, so he could have a respectable suit for his first job interviews. Every spare pfennig, every carefully hoarded mark, had gone towards his future, his advancement. When he met Brigitte, a sleek, modern young woman with a degree in marketing and an appetite for the finer things in life, I had been, I confess, a little apprehensive. She was so different from the girls Klaus had known before, girls from our neighborhood, girls who understood the value of a hard-earned mark, the comfort of a shared bowl of lentil soup on a cold winter's night. Brigitte, with her expensive perfume and her dismissive little laugh, seemed to find our world, my world, rather quaint, an anachronism, an embarrassment. But Klaus was smitten. He saw in her, I think, a reflection of the life he craved, a life of effortless sophistication, of unearned privilege, and I, wanting only his happiness, had welcomed her into our family, into our home, with as much warmth as I could muster, trying to ignore the faint, persistent chill that seemed to emanate from her very pores. Their visits, initially polite and infrequent, became more regular after Wilhelm passed. The apartment, Wilhelm's legacy, our shared sanctuary, suddenly seemed to hold a new allure for them. It was spacious by Berlin standards, in a quiet, respectable neighborhood, close to the U-Bahn, and it was, of course, rent-free. "Mom," Klaus had said one Sunday, his voice oozing a concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Brigitte and I were thinking, this place, it's too big for you on your own, isn't it? All the upkeep, the cleaning, and you rattling around in here all alone, it worries us." Brigitte had chimed in, her voice a silken caress. "Yes, Moody." She'd started calling me Moody then, a familiarity that felt both presumptuous and vaguely insulting, as if I were some generic interchangeable mother figure, not Wilhelm's Elsa. "We think it would be much better if we moved in. We could look after you, help with the bills, keep you company. It would be a proper family home again. A proper family home. The irony was not lost on me, even then. But I was lonely. The silence in the apartment since Wilhelm's death was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The thought of having Klaus, my son, back under my roof, even with the addition of the formidable Brigitte, held a certain appeal. And so foolishly, blindly, I had agreed. They moved in not with gratitude, but with an air of proprietorial assessment, their eyes scanning my cherished possessions, Wilhelm's books, my grandmother's china, as if already cataloging them for a future estate sale. Brigitte, in particular, seemed to view my home as a blank canvas upon which to impose her own modern aesthetic. My comfortable, slightly worn Biedermeier sofa was deemed hopelessly frumpy and relegated to the spare room, replaced by a stark, angular contraption that offered neither comfort nor charm. Wilhelm's beloved collection of antique beer steins, each one with a story, was packed away in a dusty box in the cellar, dismissed as clutter. My kitchen, my domain, the heart of our home, became Brigitte's laboratory for her gourmet experiments, usually involving ingredients I couldn't pronounce and flavors I found frankly inedible. I soon realized, becoming a stranger in my own home, a tolerated but increasingly irrelevant fixture. The looking after me part of their proposition never quite materialized. The bills they managed, yes, but my small pension, which I had naively allowed them to access for convenience, seemed to dwindle with an alarming rapidity, while their own expenditures, new clothes for Brigitte, expensive gadgets for Klaus, lavish dinners at trendy restaurants I was never invited to, seemed to escalate. My company, it turned out, was rarely sought, unless it was to babysit their yapping little poodle Fifi, a creature as spoilt and demanding as its mistress, while they jetted off for important business trips that suspiciously coincided with long holiday weekends. The slow erosion of my dignity, my autonomy, was a daily, hourly occurrence. My opinions were dismissed, my routines disrupted, my very presence often ignored. I became adept at making myself small, at retreating to my bedroom, Wilhelm's and my bedroom, though it felt less and less like mine with each passing day, with a book and a cup of tea, trying to block out the sounds of their increasingly loud, increasingly confident occupation of my life. The resentment, the unspoken anger began to fester within me, a toxic brew of hurt, disappointment, and a dawning, terrifying helplessness. I was old, yes, but I was not yet dead, and I was certainly not dead weight, though I suspected that was how Brigitte, and increasingly Klaus, had come to view me. The memories of Wilhelm, of our life together in this apartment, became both a comfort and a torment. His laughter, his quiet strength, his unwavering love, they seemed to belong to a different world, a world that was receding further and further with each passing day, a world they were systematically, callously, trying to erase. I remembered Wilhelm's words, spoken often in the early difficult years of our marriage, when Berlin was still a wounded, divided city, struggling to heal. "Elsa, mein Liebling," he'd say, his calloused hand covering mine, "we are survivors. We bend, but we do not break. Remember that." I had remembered. I had survived the war, the blockade, the wall. I had survived poverty, loss, grief. Surely, I could survive this domestic coup d'etat, this slow, insidious theft of my home, my life, my very identity. But the slap, when it finally came, shattered that illusion. It was a brutal, physical manifestation of all the unspoken cruelties, all the emotional blows I had endured for so long, and in its searing, humiliating sting, it forged not surrender, but a new, unexpected, and utterly unshakable resolve. They had finally, irrevocably, gone too far, and Elsa Schmidt, Wilhelm's Elsa, the survivor, was about to remind them exactly who she was. The argument that precipitated the slap, the final brutal act of their domestic tyranny, had been in itself a trivial thing, a culmination of countless small aggressions, of 1,000 unspoken resentments. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and gray, the kind of Berlin day that seeps into your bones and chills your spirit. Brigitte had, with her usual air of imperious pronouncement, announced her intention to redecorate my living room, Wilhelm's and my living room, the room that held the faded imprint of our shared lives, the scent of his pipe tobacco still lingering, I sometimes imagined, in the heavy velvet curtains. "This wallpaper, Moody," she'd said, wrinkling her nose at the familiar, comforting pattern of roses and forget-me-nots. "It's simply depressing. So dated. I've found the most wonderful minimalist grass cloth, very zen, very now. And that dreadful old bookcase." She'd gestured towards Wilhelm's prized possession, a magnificent oak piece he'd crafted himself, filled with his beloved classics. Goethe, Schiller, Heine. "It will have to go. It just dominates the space, doesn't it, Klaus?" Klaus, who had once spent hours nestled in Wilhelm's armchair, devouring those very books, had merely grunted his assent, his eyes fixed on the financial pages of his newspaper. A small, hesitant protest had risen in my throat. "But Brigitte, dear," I'd begun, my voice trembling slightly. "That bookcase, Wilhelm made it. It holds so many memories." Brigitte had turned to me, her smile a tight, dismissive curve. "Memories are lovely, Moody, but they don't pay the bills, do they? And frankly, this apartment needs a serious update if it's ever going to reflect Klaus's status. We can't have his clients visiting a place that looks like a museum of domestic drudgery. Museum of domestic drudgery. My home, my life, reduced to that. Something inside me, something I had kept carefully tamped down for so long, began to smolder. "This is still my apartment, Brigitte," I'd said, my voice quiet but firm. "And while you and Klaus are living here as my guests, I would appreciate it if you would consult me before making such drastic alterations." Her reaction was swift, predictable. Her eyes narrowed, her pretty face hardening into a mask of affronted indignation. "Your guests, Muddy?" she'd sneered. "Is that what we are, after all we do for you? Paying the bills, ensuring you're not a burden to the state? Perhaps you'd prefer to be rattling around in here all alone, unable to manage, a forgotten old woman waiting for the inevitable." The cruelty of her words, so casually delivered, stole my breath. But before I could respond, Klaus, finally looking up from his newspaper, his face flushed, his eyes cold, had intervened. "That's enough, Mother," he'd said, his voice harsh. "Brigitte is right. This apartment needs work. And frankly, your sentimental attachment to every dusty old relic is becoming tiresome. It's time for a change. Our change." "Your change, Klaus," I'd echoed, my voice rising despite myself. "In my home, with my money. The money your father and I worked our fingers to the bone for, the money you and Brigitte seem to be spending with such reckless abandon." That's when it happened. He'd stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the polished wooden floor. His face was contorted with a rage I had never seen in him before, not even in the darkest days of his turbulent adolescence. "Don't you dare speak to Brigitte like that, old woman," he'd roared. "And don't you dare question how we spend our money. This is our home now. You're just living here on sufferance." And then his hand had lashed out, the crack of it connecting with my cheek, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the silent, shocked apartment, a sound that shattered the last fragile remnants of my maternal illusions. The sting was immediate, visceral, but it was the words that followed, spat out with a venom that chilled me to the core, that truly broke me. "This isn't your home anymore, old woman. Get out and don't come back." Brigitte, her face alight with a sickening, triumphant glee, had merely nodded her agreement. "Yes, Klaus, darling, it's time the old bird flew the nest, permanently." I stood there, my hand pressed to my burning cheek, my mind reeling, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. Disbelief warred with a dawning, terrible understanding. This was it, the final act, the ultimate betrayal. They weren't just redecorating my home, they were exorcising me from it, from their lives, as if I were an inconvenient, malevolent spirit. I didn't scream, I didn't plead. What was the point? Their faces, Klaus's contorted with a rage that was almost unrecognizable, Brigitte's with a cold, reptilian satisfaction, told me everything I needed to know. There was no love left here, no respect, no shred of human decency, only a grasping, insatiable greed and a cruelty so profound it defied comprehension. Slowly, mechanically, I turned and walked towards my bedroom, their hateful words, their triumphant laughter, echoing in my ears. I packed a small bag, my movements jerky, uncoordinated, my hands trembled so violently I could barely fasten the clasp. What to take? What remnants of a life could one salvage in the face of such utter devastation? Wilhelm's photograph, my mother's silver locket, a few worn, precious letters, the essentials. The rest, the physical manifestations of a life they had already so thoroughly desecrated, I would leave behind. As I walked out of the apartment, my apartment, for what I knew would be the last time, Neither Klaus nor Brigitte made any move to stop me. They simply stood there, watching, their expressions a mixture of smug self-satisfaction and a dawning perhaps of something else, a flicker of unease. A belated, unwelcome stirring of conscience. I didn't know. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their hatred, their greed, their utter, soul-destroying indifference. The cold Berlin air hit my face like a slap, a brutal awakening. I stood on the familiar cobblestones of my street, my small bag clutched in my trembling hand, a dispossessed refugee in my own city, my own life. Where to go? What to do? The questions swirled in my mind, a chaotic, terrifying vortex, and then, through the haze of pain and disbelief, a name surfaced. Frau Hildegard Müller, my oldest, dearest friend. Hilda, who had seen me through the darkest days, who understood, without needing to be told, the resilience, the quiet, unyielding strength that resided within the heart of every true Berliner. Hilda, who lived just a few U-Bahn stops away, in a small, cluttered apartment filled with books, cats, and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Hilda would know what to do. Hilda would help me find my way back from this abyss. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and began to walk, my footsteps echoing a silent, defiant rhythm on the unforgiving pavement. They thought they had broken me. They were wrong. Elsa Schmidt was a survivor. And this, I vowed, this was not the end of my story. It was merely the beginning of a new, unexpected, and altogether more formidable chapter. The journey to Hilda's apartment was a blur of disconnected images, of familiar streets suddenly rendered alien and hostile by the turmoil in my own heart. The U-Bahn, usually a source of mild interest, a moving tapestry of Berlin life, was now just a clattering, impersonal conveyance, each lurch, each screech of the brakes, a fresh jolt to my already shattered nerves. When I finally stood before Hilda's door, my courage almost failed me. What would I say? How could I articulate the depth of the betrayal, the humiliation, the utter desolation I felt? But Hilda, bless her intuitive soul, needed no words. She opened the door, took one look at my tear-streaked face, my trembling hands, the small forlorn bag clutched to my chest, and simply enveloped me in a fierce, comforting hug. "Ach, Elsa, mein Liebling," she murmured, her voice thick with a sympathy that was blessedly free of pity. "What have those verfluchten Schweinehunde done to you now?" Her earthy, unapologetic anger on my behalf was a strange, unexpected balm. She led me inside, settled me into her worn, comfortable armchair, the one that always smelled faintly of cats and peppermint tea, and proceeded to fuss over me, plying me with strong coffee, a thick slice of her famous Apfelstrudel, and a torrent of indignant, wonderfully comforting expletives directed at Klaus and Brigitte. Slowly, haltingly, the story poured out. The redecoration, the financial exploitation, the escalating disrespect, culminating in the slap, the brutal, public eviction. Hilda listened, her usually cheerful face hardening into a mask of grim resolve, her bright blue eyes, the eyes that had seen so much of life's joys and sorrows, blazing with a righteous fury. "The unmitigated, bodenlos Frechheit," she exclaimed, when I had finished, slamming her fist onto the small, cluttered kitchen table, making the teacups rattle. "To strike his own mother, to throw you out of your own home. Wilhelm, may he rest in peace, would turn in his grave. This cannot be allowed to stand, Elsa. This injustice, it cries out to heaven." Her outrage, so fierce, so unequivocal, was more restorative than any amount of gentle commiseration could have been. It validated my pain, my anger. It made me feel seen, understood, less alone. "But what can I do, Hilda?" I whispered, the fight momentarily draining out of me, leaving behind only a weary, hopeless despair. "I am an old woman. I have nothing. They have taken everything." "Nonsense, Elsa," Hilda snorted, her eyes flashing. "You are not nothing. You are Elsa Schmidt. You survived the bombs, the hunger, the wall. You raised that undankbare Bengal. Single-handedly after Wilhelm died. You have a strength in you, my friend, a resilience that those two pampered, selfish parasites cannot even begin to comprehend. And as for having nothing," she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "are you quite sure about that, Elsa? The apartment, Wilhelm's apartment, whose name is on the Grundbuch, the deed." I frowned, trying to remember. It had been so long ago, when Wilhelm and I had finally, proudly, paid off the last of the mortgage. "Both our names, I think," I said. "Wilhelm Schmidt and Elsa Schmidt." Hilda's eyes lit up. "Aha, and did you by any chance ever sign any documents transferring your share, your ownership, to Klaus, or to that Giftschlange, Brigitte?" I thought back, sifting through the memories of the past few years, the papers Klaus had occasionally asked me to sign. Just formalities, Mom. Nothing to worry about, but nothing related to the apartment itself, not its ownership, not its title. No, I said, a flicker of something, hope, igniting within me. No, I don't believe I ever did. Hilda slammed her hand on the table again, this time with a triumphant, ha. Then, my dear Elsa, they have not taken everything. They may be occupying your home, but they do not own it. Not entirely, and perhaps, not legally, if they have indeed thrown you out without due process. The legal intricacies were beyond my ken, but Hilda, despite her lack of formal legal training, possessed a formidable street-smart understanding of German property law, gleaned from years of navigating her own often contentious dealings with landlords and city bureaucrats. We need a lawyer, Elsa, she declared, her voice firm. A proper one, someone who specializes in, well, in dealing with grasping, ungrateful offspring, and their equally odious spouses. And I think, she added, a mischievous twinkle in her eye, I know just the woman, Frau Dr. Ingrid Vogel. A dragon, some say, but a dragon you definitely want on your side. Frau Dr. Vogel. The name sounded formidable, intimidating, but in that moment, formidable was exactly what I needed. Intimidating was exactly what Klaus and Brigitte deserved. The small flicker of hope within me began to grow, fanned by Hilda's unwavering conviction, her infectious optimism. Perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps this was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. A battle for my home, yes. But more importantly, a battle for my dignity, my self-respect, my right to exist, not as dead weight, not as an old bird to be flown from the nest, but as Elsa Schmidt, a woman of worth, a woman of substance, a woman who, despite everything, was not yet broken. The Apfelstrudel, I realized, suddenly tasted a little sweeter, the coffee, a little stronger. The fight, it seemed, was on. The appointment with Frau Dr. Ingrid Vogel was, as Hilda had predicted, an experience. Her office, in a rather austere building in Charlottenburg, was a study in minimalist efficiency, all gleaming chrome, black leather, and a distinct absence of anything remotely resembling clutter or sentimentality. Frau Dr. Vogel herself was a woman who radiated an almost palpable aura of competence and controlled ferocity. Tall, impeccably dressed in a severe gray suit, her silver hair swept back in an uncompromising chignon, her gaze sharp, intelligent, and utterly unsentimental. She listened to my story, and Hilda's occasional, indignant interjections, without a flicker of expression, her fingers steepled, her eyes fixed on my face. There was no coddling, no cooing sympathy, just a focused, intense concentration that was, in its own way, profoundly reassuring. When I had finished, she asked a series of brisk, pointed questions about the ownership of the apartment, about any documents I might have signed, about my financial situation, my pension, the access Klaus and Brigitte had to my accounts. Her inquiries were thorough, relentless, leaving no stone unturned. And the slap, Frau Schmidt? She asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Were there any witnesses? Only Brigitte, I stammered, the memory still a fresh, burning humiliation. Frau Dr. Vogel made a small, almost imperceptible grimace. Pity. An independent witness would have been useful. However, she continued, her tone brisk, the illegal eviction, the potential misappropriation of funds, the breach of trust, these are all actionable. And the fact that your name, Frau Schmidt, is still presumably on the Grundbuch as co-owner, or perhaps even sole inheritor after your husband's passing, gives us considerable leverage regarding the apartment itself. She explained the legal options. We could file for an immediate injunction to prevent Klaus and Brigitte from making any further alterations to the apartment, or from attempting to sell or transfer its ownership. We could demand a full accounting of my finances, and if misappropriation was proven, sue for the recovery of stolen funds. And most importantly, we could initiate legal proceedings to have them formally, legally evicted from my home. The thought of such a public confrontational process was daunting. The idea of facing Klaus, my own son, in a courtroom, of airing our family's dirty linen for all the world to see, filled me with a mixture of dread and a grim, reluctant satisfaction. "This will not be pleasant, Frau Schmidt," Frau Dr. Vogel cautioned, as if reading my mind. "Family disputes rarely are. They will likely fight back, recriminate, attempt to portray you as, well, you can imagine. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at Hilda, who gave me a small, encouraging nod. I thought of Wilhelm, of the home we had built together, the life we had shared. I thought of the humiliation, the disrespect, the casual cruelty I had endured, and I thought of the slap, the searing, indelible sting of it. "Yes, Frau Dr. Vogel," I said, my voice clear, steady. "I am prepared. I want my home back, and I want them to understand, unequivocally, that they cannot treat another human being, let alone their own mother, in such a despicable manner, and expect to get away with it." A flicker of something, approval, respect, crossed Frau Dr. Vogel's stern features. "Very good, Frau Schmidt," she said. "That is the attitude we require. Now, let us begin." The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. Affidavits were sworn, documents were filed, letters couched in impenetrable legal eyes were dispatched. Hilda, my loyal, indefatigable ally, accompanied me to every appointment, her cheerful pragmatism a constant source of strength. She even, bless her, took it upon herself to act as my unofficial private investigator, gleaning snippets of information about Klaus and Brigette's increasingly lavish lifestyle from her network of neighborhood gossips, information that proved surprisingly useful to Frau Dr. Vogel in building our case regarding the misappropriation of funds. The first official notification from Frau Dr. Vogel's office, informing Klaus and Brigitte of the impending legal action and demanding their immediate cessation of any further alterations to the apartment, was, according to Hilda's sources, who had apparently witnessed the postal carrier's arrival with a certain gleeful anticipation, met with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and apoplectic rage. There were apparently raised voices, slammed doors, and a hastily convened late-night visit from a rather expensive-looking lawyer of their own. The battle lines were drawn. The initial skirmishes had begun, and I, Elsa Schmidt, the old bird they had so contemptuously flown from the nest, was, with the formidable Frau Dr. Vogel as my general and the indomitable Hilda as my trusted lieutenant, preparing to reclaim my territory. The fight would be long, I knew, and messy, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel for a very long time: hope, a fierce, defiant, and utterly exhilarating hope. The legal chess game that ensued was, as Frau Dr. Vogel had predicted, both protracted and unpleasant. Klaus and Brigitte, through their slick city lawyer, a man whose expensive suit and condescending smirk reminded me uncomfortably of Brigitte herself, employed every tactic imaginable to delay, to obfuscate, to intimidate. They filed countermotions, questioned the validity of my claims, even had the audacity to suggest that my actions were a sign of age-related cognitive decline and that they were the true victims, forced to endure the erratic and vindictive behavior of an ungrateful and increasingly senile mother. The accusation of senility, so predictable, so demeaning, stung, of course, but Frau Dr. Vogel, with her characteristic cool efficiency, quickly dispatched it, producing medical reports from my own trusted physician, Dr. Keller, confirming my soundness of mind, my capacity to manage my own affairs. "They are flailing, Frau Schmidt," she'd said, after one particularly unpleasant exchange of legal correspondence, "throwing mud in the hope that some of it will stick. It is a sign of desperation, not strength." The demand for a full financial accounting, however, was one they could not so easily evade. After weeks of delays and increasingly flimsy excuses, they were finally compelled by court order to produce bank statements, credit card records, receipts. The documents, when they finally arrived at Frau Dr. Vogel's office, voluminous and poorly organized, told a damning tale. My modest pension, my carefully hoarded savings, the small inheritance Wilhelm had left me, all had been systematically plundered, siphoned off to fund a lifestyle far beyond their legitimate means. There were charges for luxury holidays I had certainly never taken, for designer clothes that would have dwarfed my entire wardrobe, for expensive restaurant meals I had never been invited to share. There were unexplained cash withdrawals, large regular transfers to accounts in Brigitte's maiden name, even, most gallingly, payments towards the very renovations they had undertaken in my apartment, the ones designed to erase my presence, my history, my very identity. The evidence was irrefutable. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was calculated, systematic theft, a betrayal so profound it left me breathless. Even Frau Dr. Vogel, a woman not easily shocked, had raised an eyebrow at the sheer brazenness of their avarice. "They have been remarkably thorough in their embezzlement, Frau Schmidt," she'd commented, her voice laced with a dry, almost imperceptible irony. The most painful revelation, however, was the discovery that Klaus had, shortly after they moved in, taken out a substantial second mortgage on the apartment. Using a forged power of attorney document, he had tricked me into signing, amidst a flurry of other household management papers. The loan, he had claimed, was for essential repairs and upgrades to ensure my continued comfort and safety. In reality, the funds had been used to finance a disastrously unsuccessful investment in one of his friend's harebrained business schemes, an investment that had, predictably, vanished without a trace. My home, Wilhelm's, and my sanctuary, the one tangible asset we had worked our entire lives to secure, was now encumbered with a crippling debt, a debt incurred through my own son's deceit and reckless greed. That knowledge, more than the slap, more than the eviction, more than the theft of my savings, was the deepest cut of all. It felt like a desecration, a violation of everything Wilhelm and I had held dear. Can we save the apartment, Frau Dr. Vogel?" I'd asked, my voice trembling, the fight momentarily draining out of me. She had looked at me then, her usually stern features softening with a rare, almost maternal compassion. "It will be difficult, Elsa," she'd said, using my first name for the first time. "The forged power of attorney, we can challenge that, of course. But the debt, it is a significant encumbrance. However," she'd added, a steely glint returning to her eye, "we will fight. We will explore every avenue, and we will ensure that Klaus and Brigitte are held accountable, not just for the money they have stolen, but for the trust they have so callously, so criminally betrayed." The prospect of losing the apartment, the one tangible link to Wilhelm, to my past, was a devastating blow, but in a strange way, it also solidified my resolve. This was no longer just about reclaiming a physical space. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, my very identity, from those who had sought to strip me of it all. The legal battle escalated. There were preliminary hearings, depositions, endless rounds of legal wrangling. Klaus and Brigitte, faced with the mounting evidence of their deceit, became increasingly desperate, their accusations more outlandish, their demeanor in court a mixture of sullen resentment and feigned victimhood. I, on the other hand, found a strange, unexpected strength in the process. Guided by Frau Dr. Vogel's calm competence, supported by Hilda's unwavering loyalty, I faced them, day after day, my voice clear, my gaze steady, my testimony a simple, unshakable recitation of the truth. The old bird they had so contemptuously dismissed was proving to be a surprisingly formidable opponent, and the wheels of justice, though grinding slowly, were, I sensed, finally beginning to turn in my favor. The courtroom drama, when it finally unfolded in its full, unedifying spectacle, was less like the dramatic television programs and more like a slow, tedious unpicking of a very tangled, very dirty ball of string. Days were spent with lawyers presenting documents, questioning witnesses, arguing arcane points of law. Klaus and Brigitte, seated across the courtroom, rarely met my gaze. Klaus, when he was forced to testify, was a study in evasiveness, his answers vague, his memory conveniently faulty. He blamed Brigitte. He blamed his business partners. He blamed the economic climate, anyone and everyone but himself. Brigitte, when her turn came, adopted a posture of tearful, wounded innocence. She portrayed herself as a loving, if perhaps naive wife, misled by her husband, overwhelmed by the responsibilities of caring for an increasingly difficult mother-in-law. Her performance, I had to admit, was a masterclass in manipulative melodrama, though I doubted it fooled the stern-faced, experienced judge for a moment. My own testimony was, by contrast, simple, direct, and unembellished. I recounted the facts, the sequence of events, the broken promises, the financial deceptions, the emotional cruelty. I spoke of Wilhelm, of our life together, of the home we had built, the legacy they had sought to destroy. I did not raise my voice. I did not weep, though the effort to maintain my composure was, at times, immense. I simply told my truth, calmly, clearly, with a dignity that I hoped, silently, shamed them. The turning point, I believe, came during the cross-examination regarding the forged power of attorney. Klaus's lawyer, a slick, aggressive man named Herr Adler, attempted to portray me as a confused, forgetful old woman, easily manipulated, perhaps even complicit in Klaus's financial schemes. "Frau Schmidt," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension, "are you quite sure you understood the documents your son asked you to sign?" Is it not possible that in your advanced years, your memory might be unreliable? Before Frau Dr. Vogel could object, I had answered, my voice surprisingly firm. Herr Adler, I said, fixing him with a steady gaze, my memory, I assure you, is perfectly intact. I remember, with crystal clarity, the promises my son made when he and his wife moved into my home. I remember the sacrifices his father and I made to provide him with an education, a future. And I remember, with a clarity that still chills me to the bone, the sting of his hand across my face, and the sound of his voice telling me to get out of my own home. Are those the memories you wish to challenge, Herr Adler? Or are they perhaps a little too reliable for your client's comfort? A stunned silence descended upon the courtroom. Herr Adler flushed a dull, angry red. The judge, I noted with a flicker of grim satisfaction, was struggling to suppress a smile. From that moment on, the tide seemed to turn. The evidence of financial malfeasance was overwhelming, irrefutable. The forgery of the power of attorney, expertly demonstrated by forensic document examiners, was undeniable. Klaus and Brigitte's carefully constructed facade of filial concern, of victimhood, crumbled under the weight of their own deceit. The judgment, when it was finally delivered, was a decisive victory for us. The forged power of attorney was declared null and void. Klaus was found guilty of fraud and misappropriation of funds. He was ordered to repay a significant portion of the money he had stolen, though Frau Dr. Vogel cautioned me that recovering the full amount, especially given his disastrous business dealings, would be a long and arduous process. And most importantly, the second mortgage on my apartment, procured through deceit, was invalidated. The apartment itself, however, was a more complex issue. While my ownership was reaffirmed, the existing debt, even with the mortgage invalidated, combined with the legal fees and the general turmoil, made its continued retention a daunting prospect. After much soul-searching and long, heartfelt discussions with Hilda and Frau Dr. Vogel, I made a difficult decision. I would sell the apartment, my home, Wilhelm's, and my sanctuary. The thought was a fresh wave of grief, a final painful severance, but it also felt necessary. The apartment, however beloved, was now tainted by their betrayal, its memories overlaid with the ugliness of their greed. I needed a fresh start, a clean slate, a place where I could rebuild my life, my peace, free from the ghosts of their destructive presence. The court ordered Klaus and Brigitte to vacate the premises within 30 days. Their eviction, I was told by Hilda, who had of course kept a close and rather gleeful watch on the proceedings, was a pitiful, squalid affair. They left not with dignity, but with a trail of recriminations, unpaid bills, and a general air of resentful, self-inflicted victimhood. I did not go to see them leave. I did not wish to witness their final, ignominious departure from the home they had so casually, so cruelly, usurped. My victory was not in their humiliation, but in my own quiet, hard-won reclamation of justice, of dignity, of self. The sale of the apartment, my beloved home on Schillerstrasse, was handled with quiet efficiency by a reputable estate agent Frau Dr. Vogel recommended. It sold quickly, to a young couple, an architect and a musician, who I was told fell in love with its high ceilings, its original parquet floors, its air of slightly faded old-world charm. They spoke, apparently, of restoring it with respect, of filling it with music and laughter. The thought brought a small bittersweet comfort. At least it would be loved again, cherished, not desecrated. The proceeds from the sale, combined with the partial repayment of funds recovered from Klaus, a process that was, as Frau Dr. Vogel had predicted, ongoing and fraught with difficulty, as Klaus, it turned out, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, were not a vast fortune, but they were enough for me to secure a comfortable, if modest, future, enough for me to finally blessedly breathe free. Hilda, my rock, my confidante, my co-conspirator in the battle for justice, was of course instrumental in helping me navigate the next chapter. She vetoed, with characteristic bluntness, my initial inclination to find a small, anonymous room in some faceless retirement complex. "Nonsense, Elsa," she declared. "You are not going to fade away into beige obscurity. You are a survivor, a warrior. You need a place with character, with life, with a balcony big enough for your geraniums, and a kitchen that can accommodate at least 2 opinionated old women, and a large Apfelstrudel." And so, with Hilda's enthusiastic, if somewhat overwhelming assistance, I found it. A small sunny apartment in a charming Altbau building in Friedenau, a quiet, leafy neighborhood filled with bookstores, little cafes, and a surprising number of contented-looking cats sunning themselves in shop windows. It wasn't Schillerstrasse, it wasn't Wilhelm's and my home, but it had potential. It had light and warmth, and a small wrought-iron balcony overlooking a shared courtyard garden where an ancient lilac bush bloomed with a defiant, fragrant beauty each spring. Moving in was a surprisingly cathartic experience. There were so few physical possessions I had salvaged from my old life, so little to unpack.
Just Wilhelm's photograph, my mother's silver locket, a few treasured books, a handful of faded letters. But as I arranged these small precious talismans in my new surroundings, a sense of peace, of rightness began to settle over me. This was my space now, mine alone, untainted by betrayal, unmarred by disrespect, a blank canvas upon which to paint the final, quiet chapter of my own choosing. My days settled into a new gentle rhythm, morning walks in the nearby park, the air fresh and clean, the trees a soothing canopy of green. Afternoons spent reading on my balcony, a cup of strong coffee by my side, the distant sounds of the city a comforting hum. Evenings often spent with Hilde, sharing a simple meal, a bottle of crisp Riesling, and endless meandering conversations about everything and nothing. We joined a seniors art class at the local community center, discovering to our mutual surprise a shared if somewhat nascent talent for surprisingly expressive, if technically flawed watercolor painting. Our creations, mostly lopsided renderings of fruit bowls and rather startled-looking cats, brought us endless amusement. Of Klaus, I heard very little. His attempts to appeal the court's judgment had failed. His legal bills, I was reliably informed by Frau Dr. Vogel, who seemed to maintain a discreet professional interest in his ongoing misfortunes, were crippling. He and Brigitte had apparently separated, their once united front of ambition and avarice having crumbled under the weight of financial ruin and mutual recrimination. Brigitte, I heard, had decamped to live with her equally odious mother in some provincial backwater. Klaus, stripped of his ill-gotten gains, his home, his wife, was rumored to be living in a series of increasingly shabby rented rooms, his once bright career prospects now considerably dimmed. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only a distant, weary sadness. He was still my son, my child, and to see him so reduced, so broken, by his own greed, his own folly, was a pain that lingered, a dull ache in the background of my newfound peace. But it was his path to walk now, his consequences to bear. I had done all I could. I had fought for my dignity, for my rights, for the memory of Wilhelm, for the sanctity of our shared life, and I had, in my own quiet way, won. My legacy, I decided, would not be one of bitterness or revenge. It would be one of resilience, of quiet strength, of the enduring power of the human spirit, to survive, to heal, to find a measure of peace, even after the deepest of betrayals. And perhaps, just perhaps, it would also be a silent, enduring testament to the simple, profound truth that an old woman's worth is not measured in what can be taken from her, but in the quiet, unshakable dignity she refuses to surrender. The final act of my story, or perhaps more accurately, this particular, rather tumultuous chapter of it, unfolded not with a dramatic confrontation or a grand resolution, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the landscape of my own heart. Years passed.